Thank you very much, Michael. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. As mentioned by the former speaker, it's been a terrible year for the whole world, for every region, but in fact the region that in the World Bank we call Europe and Central Asia, basically the Central and Eastern Europe and the countries of the former Soviet Union, the impact of the crisis has been much more negative than any other of the emerging regions. So looking at the way the World Bank groups it, if we compare to Latin America and the Caribbean, or East Asia, where obviously it's dominated by continued robust growth in China, Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, mainly driven by continued growth in India, or Sub-Saharan Africa, you can see that our region, in which the Western Balkans is part of it, has had a much more negative effect. On average, a decline in 2009 of over 5%, and growth, as was mentioned by the EBRD speaker, only likely to come back to under 2% next year. So the impact has been much stronger in this region. Just a little marketing here. The World Bank has just put out a new book called Turmoil at 20. When this was originally conceived 2 or 3 years ago, it was supposed to be a celebration of 20 years of transition and integration into the European Union and so forth. And in fact, it's now looking very much at the causes of the recession and the reforms that are needed for recovery, and trying to analyze why this region has been so much more badly hit than other emerging regions. And in a nutshell, it's basically because it was much more integrated, both financial markets, trade and labour markets and remittances, way more integrated than many of the other regions. That was an asset during the last few years of robust growth, but it's also meant that when the world has slowed down, the impact here has been very great. As was mentioned, within the Western Balkan countries, there is some variation still, with Albania and Kosovo both able to still grow, not as fast as before, but still respectable growth rates of 3 or 4%, but well below the 7 or 8% that they've seen in the last few years and that they need for sustained poverty reduction, improve the quality of lives. In the other countries, declines from -2 to -4%. I wanted to focus my remarks perhaps on a topic that hasn't been covered this morning and that I thought the other speakers wouldn't talk about so much, which is the impact of the crisis on poverty and on households, the social impact of the crisis, if you like. And in fact, the bank has also just put out a new report called The Crisis Hits Home, which tries to look at, using very detailed poverty data, the impact of the crisis on households throughout the region. Taking here some of the simulations just for the Western Balkans, what you need to do is look at the green line and the blue line and compare them. And I suppose one point to make before is that a huge success of the Western Balkans over the last decade has been a very steady decline in poverty reduction as a result of sustained growth over the last decade and investments in education and health, social transfer programs. But in any case, poverty has been declining very steadily. And the problem with the crisis is that it's halted that decline in poverty and actually reversed it, meaning that we've now got more households who are poor or vulnerable than we would have had without the crisis. And the simulations here, the green and the blue lines, these are simulations, so they try and look at what poverty is projected to be in 2010. In the green line, it's using the growth rates that we had projected in April 2008 before the crisis, and the blue line is what we now expect in terms of growth rates. And as you can see, for the Western Balkans, the prediction of this model is that some 30% of the population is likely to be poor or vulnerable. We're using a $5 a day indicator, so it is not just those who are poor, but those who are vulnerable of becoming poor. There's been an increase in 5%, and this translates to 800,000 more people in poverty than would have been the case before the crisis. Here, probably hard to read, but the red is the Western Balkans, the blue is the other countries. But you actually then see the percentage increase in poverty predicted by this model before and after the crisis. And you see that it's really a middle-income country crisis in that it's the relatively richer countries that are facing more of an impact and more of an impact in terms of increases in poverty. But some very sobering numbers there, the model suggesting that up to 60% more people poor and vulnerable using this $5 a day line in Bosnia and Herzegovina, conceivably up to 30% more in Serbia, 12 and 15% in the other countries. Households are obviously affected by the crisis in many different ways. There's the impact of the financial crisis, because many households, even poor households, actually do have debt. So the cost of the debt or their access to debt is much tougher now. Relative price shocks where countries have seen exchange rate depreciations, the cost of imports, food, in many cases have gone up. But the biggest impact is obviously through the labour market, through unemployment rising, wages declining, wage arrears in many cases. Even if people hold on to their jobs, they're not getting paid immediately. They're being paid with a several months lag. And also government services. We've seen that as the countries have faced fiscal problems, there's had to be in some cases cuts in the amount of resources going for education, health and social protection, or that's a risk that that will have to happen in the future, and therefore it affects service delivery. The figures I quoted earlier are based on simulations. Obviously, when you have a crisis like this, everybody wants to have accurate, timely, up-to-date figures on poverty, and that's very hard to get. I mean, an overall challenge for the region is to improve the quality and reliability and timeliness of statistics, and particularly in the area of poverty. Serbia is an exception, and I think we've been working with the government for a number of years, and Serbia now has actually quarterly household surveys that give quarterly poverty data, and also twice-a-year labour force surveys. And so this is able to give you actually quite an accurate, up-to-date indicator of what is happening with poverty in Serbia, based including on labour market data. And there we see that based on this household survey and labour market data, that poverty in just 9 months, from the third quarter of 2008 to the first half of 2009, has increased from 4.7% to 7.4%. And looking at the labour force data, which is particularly interesting, what you see is unemployment has risen, and across the region unemployment has risen, although registered unemployment hasn't grown so significantly. But what the Serbia data is showing us is that there's actually a pretty large movement from employment into inactive. So people aren't registered as unemployed, but they're not active. The numbers, I think the numbers are more telling perhaps than the rates here, is that the number of unemployed rose by more than 31,000 in Serbia during this 9-month period. The number of inactive rose by 4%, more than 130,000 people. And that, is going to translate into poverty for the families of those workers. The other big area of concern is remittances. The Western Balkans generally is very dependent on remittances. Kosovo is one of the 20 most, in terms of percentage of GDP coming from remittances, it's in the top 20 in the world. But Albania and Bosnia also, remittances are an incredibly important part of the safety net for poor and lower income households. We see in Kosovo, for example, that remittances are equivalent to 2/3 of the monthly wage and 30% or more of household monthly expenditure, and this is even higher in rural areas. And we just actually did a quick migration survey in Kosovo. This is very recent, this data in late 2009. And while you can't yet show a decrease in remittances, what you see is that more than half of the households are expecting large reductions in remittances. And there's a lot of international evidence to suggest that declines in remittances show up with a lag. What we also saw from the Kosovo data is that the number of migrants is going down as well, either because of policy changes or just lack of jobs in the neighbouring countries. We don't have good statistics on remittances, and indeed in Serbia and so on we haven't yet seen a decline, but there is a concern that while remittances generally tend to be estimated by the central banks, partly they get money that comes through formal flows through the banking system, and you can measure that pretty accurately. But there's a lot of informal remittances that come in, suitcases and people's pockets and so forth. That's very hard to measure. An indicator is the amount of money that gets changed in in the foreign exchange bureaus. But that also picks up what we call under the mattress money, so that people may have had a stock of cash accumulated over the years under their mattresses, and they've been drawing that down. And so that may be part of the reason that the estimates of remittances don't yet show a decline. But there is a real concern that in 2010 we will start to see remittances decline with impacts on poor people. And of course, at a time when poverty is increasing, you would want governments to be able to provide support to some of these vulnerable households. But as has been mentioned by a number of speakers, the crisis has led to sharp increases in fiscal deficits across the Balkans. So just as there's a greater need for support to poor households, governments are having to retrench, and there's a need for consolidation of these fiscal deficits. And so that means that perhaps more important than anything, and this is my final point, is a need to look at the social spending, the social protection spending that governments have at the moment, and target it more precisely to the poorest. What you see here is that Europe and Central Asia actually spends a lot on social protection generally compared to all other regions of the world. It's actually reasonably close even to the OECD countries. But the red part is basically pensions, and the blue part is safety nets, put crudely, so that you see that while countries in Europe and Central Asia are spending a lot compared to other emerging regions, much of that is pensions. Pensions is, if you like, crowding out other social protection programs. When looking at social protection programs, one looks a lot at targeting. First of all, two indicators. One, if we look at the very poorest quintile, are they well covered? So this slide shows the percentage of total benefits that actually are received by the poorest quintile. And then the next slide, oh, I only have one there. Okay, so there's, oops, I lost them. There's basically two indicators. First of all, you want to know of the poorest quintile, are they getting covered? And the data is not so promising. I mean, about 40% on average of the poorest quintile is benefiting from this social protection spending. I mean, 60% of the poorest quintile are not getting social spending. And then what you also see is there's a lot of leakage, a lot of social protection spending. This is particularly acute in Bosnia, but it's true in a number of the countries. A lot of the social protection spending is going to people who are not poor. And so the big challenge going forward, in addition to all the other reforms that have been mentioned in terms of improving the investment climate, improving investments in infrastructure, strengthening institutions to get growth going, is that at a time of very tight fiscal budgets, to make sure that the money that is going for social protection programs is better targeted. And the bank is trying to work with a number of countries to see how the programs, where there are good programs that are well targeted, how these can be scaled up and the coverage increased and maybe the amount of money increased. But other programs, and there are many, many other programs that are not well targeted, how these could be cut back, which is politically very difficult to do, but is one of the reforms that I wanted to leave with you that will be important to help the poorest weather the impact of the crisis. Thank you. Sorry if I overran my time.